From The Times and the Sunday Times, I'm Luke Jones. This is The Story. So Keir Starmer hasn't even hit 100 days in office yet, but he's already had to tacitly admit that his number 10 hasn't been working.
This is turning out to be the most fraught period in this new government's short lifespan.
Keir Starmer arrived at Downing Street promising change, but now he's being described as the king of the freebies.
The centre of government just didn't have that grip on all kinds of controversies in recent weeks, whether it was the freebies, whether it was the clothes, whether it was the Taylor Swift tickets, whether it was Lord Alli.
From today, his Downing Street is under new management.
We've had outrage over donations, a hoo-ha over freebies. The Sunday Times arguably got the ball rolling on this in August when they revealed that Starmer's biggest personal donor, Lord Alli, had a security pass to Downing Street. £32,000 worth of clothes were given to Starmer, over £2,000 on glasses, not to mention the frocks for Starmer's wife. As ever in politics, this ends with a finger of blame finally settling on someone, in this case, Starmer's Chief of Staff, Sue Gray. Our reporter takes us through his role in the drama. The story today, how the Sunday Times broke the freebies scandal.
My name is Gabriel Pogrund. I am the Whitehall editor at the Sunday Times.
If people don't know you, Gabriel, you're sort of quite widely known now as a scoopster, as a S-stirrer. Is that fair?
I'll take either description. I definitely try to bring a investigative approach to political reporting. We have an amazing political team at the Sunday Times, but I've always seen it as my job to go a little bit beyond day-to-day political reporting. And nobody can say we've been lacking inspiration and material over the last few years. I just didn't anticipate that Labour would provide much, so much material so swiftly.
I mean, we'll get into your role in that in a moment. But first, in terms of the current expression of that dysfunction, Sue Gray out, Morgan McSweeney in, and the rest. So soon into a new government, can you explain what's going on? I guess the two factions and broadly why it's come to this.
Yes. I mean, let's try distill it in a way which is decipherable to people who don't spend their lives dwelling on Labour. Keir Starmer retained the services of Sue Gray, this career civil servant with a storied past who had been this quite singular figure in Whitehall as a kind of ethics enforcer and inquisitor in chief, and who had latterly written the Partygate inquiry into Boris Johnson's number 10. He hired her about a year before the election as his chief of staff with a mandate to prepare the party for government and make sure that Labour's first 100 days were the smoothest, the most effective for any incoming administration in recent times. And it just so happens that the first 100 days have been just about the least effective conceivable, owing to a blizzard of revelations and allegations, some of which first appeared in the Times and Sunday Times relating to Starmer's receipt of gifts. But actually underlying that, there's been a sense that MPs and ministers have themselves acknowledged that there isn't enough of a story about what it is that Starmer's trying to do with the country. Coupled with that, there's been unhappiness about that which has been announced in the form of some pretty tough cuts to winter fuel payments. And then undergirding all of that, there was just a lot of unhappiness about the way that Sue Gray herself conducted herself. And I've read a lot of the papers have chronicled a Morgan McSweeney, Sue Gray divide, McSweeney being Starmer's great strategic advisor and thinker, there is no doubt that people who spoke in their names in some instances bitterly disliked each other. I mean, neither Grey nor McSweeney have publicly spoken of this rift between them, and privately you'd be hard-pressed to find either of them acknowledging it. I think in Grey's instance, she did routinely speak in private of the idea that there was a boys' club at the summit of the party, which many people, I think, quite fairly interpreted as being a critique of McSweeney and some fellow travellers of his from the Blairite wing of the party, who, in Grey's eyes, seemed to have influence that superseded that of most ministers, and that was her problem, even if it wasn't personal and specific about McSweeney himself. And I think that the people around McSweeney wanted the Grey appointment to work. But in the end, I suspect it's less a case of McSweeney or any one person versus Sue. And I think by the end, Starmer, McSweeney, Whitehall up to a point, and even some people in the cabinet accepted that it was not working, that the Downing Street operation was not working, that they hadn't gripped these scandals and stories, but also that the government itself wasn't firing on all cylinders. And so she was removed a few days ago.
And part of this latest hoo-ha, I guess, emanated from these scandals about freebies and passes for glasses and the rest, which people will remember. And partly this boils down to Lord Alli and some of the donations that he has made. When did you first start suspecting that there might be a story there in Lord Alli, his donations and what they were paying for?
I don't want to claim any great prescience, but I do remember speaking to my editor some time ago, actually, and talking about this man who is not, or was not, by any means a well-known figure. I mean, he is a fascinating human being. First gay Muslim peer, television and fashion magnate, a absolute stalwart of the party's Blairite wing. And I remember just hearing his name, talking to people in Labour land. They refer to him as Wahid. People just say, oh, we were at Wahid's the other day, or, Keir was at Wahid's, or, oh, well, Wahid was doing that with Sue, or Wahid was doing that with Morgan. You just started creeping into conversation when one spoke to people at the summit of the party. And I remember saying to my editor at the Sunday Times that this was going to be a story. I didn't really know how or in what way, but it felt like he had a degree of proximity to Starmer that was going to pose problems because of his status as a donor, not least given the aggression with which Labour prosecuted the case against the Tories for sleaze and for their failure to properly distinguish between party fundraising and government. I mean, it's very rarely in journalism do we try and say what people's intentions are or get into people's heads. I've never thought that Lord Alli was a nasty or unkind person. That's not really the thrust of the stories, but I sensed that structurally he was being put in a position that was probably going to pose problems for him and Starmer later on.
And your first story on this, correct me if I'm wrong, is that he had such good connections and access to people that he had a pass for number 10 Downing Street.
That's right. My colleague Patrick Maguire and I broke that story, must have been a couple of months ago now. And we were told by somebody who was genuinely dismayed by it for two reasons. One was that nobody knew why he had this pass. Our source was not somebody who spoke to newspapers routinely, but was genuinely just bewildered by how this had happened and uncomfortable about it, because there are not many people get given all access all areas security pass to Downing Street. And, for what it is worth, just to peel behind the curtain for a second, it is perfectly easy to get in with a guest pass, or if you're accompanied by somebody who does have access. So people, ministers, political advisors, guests come in and out of that building all the time. So this source of ours was a little curious and concerned that a man who, for all his many other achievements and for all the other lines on his CV, was also Starmer's biggest personal donor, had this access. And it had also become apparent that he had used this pass for, among other reasons, to host a party, a sort of victory reception with sandwiches and wine in the garden of Downing Street, attended by donors. And I said a few moments ago that it's not my job to do armchair psychoanalysis of people and say why I think people do things. But on the topic of this source, I think in this instance that the person in question was genuinely concerned and felt that it wasn't right, and felt that the earlier that this entered the public domain or could be gotten down to the bottom of, the better for the party. Sometimes reporting is a good disinfectant for parties that aren't being the best versions of themselves, or in this instance, governments. And it was in that spirit that we got the story.
Interesting. So I get some of the people giving you this information aren't people necessarily wanting to undercut the party. They're wanting the best for it and wanting these slightly embarrassing things out there so they can be nipped in the bud. The next bit of this, of course, was the fact that it wasn't just parties and him having a pass. He was dressing Keir Starmer.
That's right. I think this is probably one of the most both bizarre but also human dimensions of the story, which is, and I think is one of the reasons why it's had the sort of impact it's had, because it's so irresistibly weird and funny and lends itself to cartoons and memes and tweets. And
I've never thought so much about the price of glasses.
it is just weird. It basically, Lord Alli has, and some of this was declared, Lord Alli had spent thousands of pounds, tens of thousands of pounds underwriting the cost of spectacles for Starmer, as well as work clothes and suits, and then funding dresses and other clothing for Victoria Starmer, his wife. This is not only, I keep using this word that it's strange or weird.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is difficult for people to comprehend, because Starmer, he is not a top league of wealth. He's not a Rishi Sunak, but he is absolutely in the sort of upper tier of wealth in society. And
he's not skinned.
He is not skinned. So I think that people find it very difficult to understand both why he needs anybody to fund something as sort of intimate and personal as his clothing, and then why that which he needs is so expensive. But the real problem, as we revealed, was that not all of the arrangement had been declared. And there is just something very toxic about the idea that the person who pays money or parts ways with cash for your wardrobe separately being able to walk in and out of Downing Street. I think that, at least in terms of perceptions, was a very difficult one for Starmer.
And that was the sort of next big news line on this, as you've hinted at there, that you got to, is that not all of it was declared in the proper way. Starmer failed to disclose the dresses purchased for his wife, Victoria. How do you get at that?
So I guess, journalists always have different ways of conducting their craft and approaching stories. And some people are geniuses using open source intelligence and data, and other people prefer to develop relationships with sources and feel like building relationships with people are the best ways of prizing open an institution. In this instance, it was very much a case of other sources then coming forward. And it was not the source of the first story who approached me with the second story. I was speaking to a person I knew well who said, "Oh, by the way, you do know ...
Yeah.
And I was like, no, I definitely don't know that. Please, could you expand on that thesis? But it was just said to me like the most self-evident thing ever. And it hadn't been declared. I mean, I no great Bellingcat points here, but I did quickly alight on the fact that the arrangement hadn't been divulged. And the MP's Code of Conduct is clear that it should have been. And I actually found out about this, I think, before Team Starmer had proactively decided to review whether or not the clothes, which hadn't been declared initially, ought to have been. Had I gone to them before, they would have been forced around orders. They hadn't declared it at all. When I went to them in the event, their position was that, no, they hadn't declared it initially, which was a breach, but they had declared it now. But I think, frankly, rule breach or not, the power of that story was, it was a devastating data point in terms of upholding this thesis that Lord Alli had a curious, possibly unprecedented and inappropriate degree of proximity to the Prime Minister himself.
Interesting. Okay, so that's the dresses and the clothes, not gleaned by you, I know, cross-referencing the Hobbs catalogue with the Register of Members' Interests, but interesting about how you got that. The next thing, of course, was properties and also tickets. What happened there?
What was initially a succession of stories about Lord Alli's relationship with Keir Starmer then kind of mushroomed into this wider examination by other media organisations as well about not just Alli and Starmer, but Starmer and gifts and freebies, and then the cabinet and gifts and freebies full stop. It's funny, when people reflect on the story now, it's sort of self-evident that this was about freebies and also about Sue Gray's failure to grip the story. And that was just, as it happens, never necessarily the intention, but that became the reality of it, because basically there was just a lot of revelations about the fact that Starmer actually had a quite singular status on the MP's register of interest. He had accepted more freebies in the form of tickets to Taylor Swift concerts and Arsenal games and accommodation provided by Alli during the election campaign, which I think cast the original clothing in a very unflattering light. And there became this wider discussion about, well, why is it that our Prime Minister and politicians generally appear to think that freebies are just part of life as a parliamentarian? And I think that sat uncomfortably for a lot of people.
And that's the point, isn't it? There's the two buckets. There's the gifts which weren't declared and should have been, which is a breach of the rules, corrected, as you said. But then there's also the stuff which is within the rules, accepting freebies, declaring them, but just to the average person in a cost of living crisis with a new government who says that they are the grown-ups back in charge, that they are not like the last lot who were having parties during COVID and the rest. It just sits uneasily, doesn't it?
That is absolutely right. It's sort of a bit of a talking point by ministers now that no rules have been breached in connection with this. As it happens, I don't think that is the case. I think that there was the non-declaration of things, the belated declaration of things, the incorrect recording of donations. I mean, we can get in, I'm sure, to a slightly technical conversation about whether the letter of the law was upheld in this regard. But Starmer also, I think, has made himself a little bit of a hostage to fortune here, because there was no requirement for him to amplify the issue of ethics and probity to the extent that he did.
I'm absolutely determined to restore honesty and integrity to government, because I think that is core to ensuring that people appreciate that politics can be a force for good.
And many people believe he did because he genuinely does believe it, or did believe that the Tories had failed to uphold the higher standards. And I've spoken to people who say that Starmer really hated Boris Johnson's guts, and his contempt for Johnson was far more visceral than it ever was for Truss or Sunak. But there was definitely this sense that Labour had gotten into office not just based on their repudiation of Tory policy, but on the sort of moral rejection of Tories and this idea of restoring politics to service. And it is difficult to reconcile that with this notion of people getting just loads of free stuff. Very few people can articulate why it helped them fulfill their job in the first instance. It just seems to demonstrate how untethered the political class is from ordinary life.
Gabriel, I know you said earlier on that you don't necessarily get into the psychology of why people are doing these things, but I'm going to ask you to do that right now. That's okay. The question that I've had from people most throughout all of this is, what do people like Lord Alli, what do they want out of this? Is there a clear objective they are trying to achieve? I'm going to give you these tickets because I know this bit of legislation is coming down the slipway and I'd like you to vote this way. Or is it a kind of just general need to be close to those in power? I mean, why do you think he's doing this? Why is he not spending his money on nice holidays for himself?
There has been an insinuation from some reporters that there must be a quid pro quo, that, there's no way that he would be giving Starmer X without anticipating a Y in exchange. I've, just in the interest of fairness, have never for a moment thought that that was what was happening or had any evidence that that is what is happening. I think that the problem is that Lord Alli, he's not just a donor, he's a Labour peer. He became very close to Margaret McDonough, who sadly died recently. She was the General Secretary of the party under Blair. So he is definitely deeply political and has deep thoughts on politics and government. I think the problem in his instance is, what is it that he wants? I'm loath to use the phrase in return, but what does he want full stop? Clearly, he covets influence over the party and the government because he cares about both. But the question is whether that can coexist with being such a prolific donor and fundraiser. And something we've not really gotten into is the fact that he has had singular influence on things like appointments. And alongside Sue Gray, he was one of the authors of the government preparing for government plans.
What, in terms of which personnel would be on which briefs?
As I understand it, he was among a handful of people who was essentially deciding on the organogram for number 10, but also played a decisive role in thinking about appointments more generally.
And has he responded to any of this? I mean, has he given any insight into why he donates and what he's after?
No, he hasn't. He was valiantly followed around by a Sky News journalist for a few seconds at a conference, but it declined to comment.
Lord Alli, just because you've been in the news so much, can I please ask you how you feel about the donations? Do you regret making any of those donations, Lord Alli? Lord Alli, how do you feel about being in the news so much and the fact that it's overshadowed Labour conference? Lord Alli, do you have anything to say?
Is that okay if you're just going to stop here?
I have to say, I think one of the things, by the way, which gave the original story about the pass oxygen was the fact that neither he nor anybody would actually explain why he had it. This pass to Downing Street. I was referring a moment ago to how dreadful the party has looked trying to defend the freebies business. Maybe then we ought to credit them for never even bothering trying to explain the past business. But I do remember at the time in Downing Street, there was a lot of unhappiness about the fact that Patrick and I had not been given a proper account of what had gone on. One person told me at the time, there are two people that know what's really going on here. One of them is Wahid Ali and the other is Sue Gray. And Downing Street itself has not necessarily been given the full version of events. But nevertheless, the point is, Ali has said nothing at all.
All of this has shaken down with real world impacts for Starmer's government now. He's had one MP, Rosie Duffield, quit ostensibly over all of this. She said she's now an independent MP. That was a Sunday Times scoop, of course. As mentioned, Sue Gray has now left as Chief of Staff. She said it's been an honour to take on that role and to play her part in the delivery of a Labour government, but she says she's chosen to stand aside and looks forward to continuing to support the Prime Minister in her new role as an envoy for the nations and regions. With this rejig, Morgan McSweeney, as mentioned, now the new Chief of Staff. They've got a new Head of Strategic Comms, James Lyons, of course, formerly of this parish many years ago. Is this a new chapter in all of this? Do you think that the negative press will dissipate and this is them getting a firm grip?
Definitely. I mean, basically, Starmer decided that the situation couldn't go on around party conference. What we've seen over the last few days is an attempt to start again on the right side of 100 days, on the right side of the budget, on the right side of this year, and indeed on the right side of the local elections in the spring. There are two things you probably can't recover as a government. One is momentum, and two is the sort of good faith that all incoming administrations to a degree benefit from. It will be difficult for them.
But just finally, everyone is always obsessed with the question of, will the sheen come off Labour post-election? I mean, is the honeymoon absolutely over? I mean, is the champagne warm? Are the rose petals dried out and curling on the bed? They're now just facing the hard reality of government, and everyone's slightly a bit sort of questioning about them already.
I think that period is over. I don't think that's totally Starmer's fault. I think that he was blown off course by the riots. I mean, it's been pointed out to me that he's had very little time to actually just govern. I don't think he's had more than 3 successive weeks in Parliament, because he's had a succession of international conferences, there was recess, and he's barely holidayed, and yet also not been in Parliament itself that much. It has been a weirdly fragmented and difficult start, but because of these self-inflicted errors and the fact that he ultimately failed to prepare for government as he claimed he would, that honeymoon is over.
The Sunday Times did approach Lord Alli for comment, although he hasn't yet responded. Gabriel Pogrund, Whitehall editor for The Sunday Times, and you can read many more of Gabriel's scoops at thetimes.com if you have a subscription, and of course every Sunday in print. The producer today was Sam Chantarasek, the executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. If you can, leave us a review online, it'll help other people find us in the wilds of podcast land. Tomorrow, we're handing over the reins to our colleague, Times Radio Breakfast presenter Stig Abel, who's going to be interviewing Boris Johnson. Remember him? Make sure to listen to that. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.